Mr. Etheridge.
Thank you. Very good presentation. Really extremely interesting. I'm a little unsure what if you have the preconditions of an area. They must sign up to the objectives of social exclusion and the climate control, change, etc. And it's a long-term project and the funding starts going in. What if there's an election in the area in the meantime where the priorities of the local governance have changed radically from what was first agreed? What would happen then? What would kick into place? Because there seems to be a total difference there between the emphasis of the local elected authority and what was signed up to. Are they in effect committing future administrations to the same goals and objectives that they believed in by signing up to these funds?
On the what-ifs, I think we always have this vision that our programmes should provide a stable framework for funding. That's the point of it, really, that they are programmes for 7 years with another 3 years for implementation. They are not short-term responses to particular situations, but a framework for stable, at least medium-term funding. We do not expect changes every 6 months or every year, and we would see the priorities that are agreed between region and member state and commission as ones that are not politically driven in the sense of local politics. They are shared priorities that, of course, come out of a political process in terms of the commonly identified priorities, but it should not be the case that changes following an election immediately lead to rewriting a programme, and I think the Commission would have difficulty in accepting that. Having said that, a member state can always come forward, the authorities in a member state can always come forward with a proposal to modify a programme if there are clear objective reasons for doing so, because circumstances can change. The initial analysis can prove not to be fully well-founded, and therefore there are adjustments that need. This is perfectly normal, and this is allowed for. But for objective reasons linked to how the money can best be spent to deliver changes on the ground in the region.
Mr. Etheridge.
Thank you again. Another interesting presentation. A couple of quick questions. You've gone through. You've discussed how you could stop funding for something. Just wondering, theoretically, if a project was halfway through but they broke the rules and that funding was stopped, would any funding that's already gone in have to be refunded to the EU? And also, if a country does not share the EU's priority on growth and jobs through large investment of taxpayers' monies, and its priorities run counter to that, would you be able to sort of say no to all funding to that country, even if in the case of a net contributor, you're really only recycling their own money back to them, but with EU priorities? Thank you.
Please answer the questions, Mr. Nestle.
I have to excuse, but I'm not sure whether I have got the question from the gentleman. Right? Can you please raise it once more?
Yeah, the first part of it was to ask if a project, you'd already started funding it and they fell out of the guidelines and it was maybe halfway through, would they have to refund that half of the money once you'd withdrawn the funding? The second part of it was if a country does not conform to EU's priorities on spending to develop growth in the economy through that way, and its priorities run counter to that, would you be able to cut off all applications for funding for that country, even if in some cases of a net contributor, what you're really just doing is recycling the money they've paid in to bring back to them with EU priorities, but could you still cut that off?
Is it clear now? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, maybe I come back on that question. I'll try to do so. I think on the first part, you're at talking at project level, and you refer to guidelines, but I'm not quite sure which guidelines you're referring to here, because what we are we're making a presentation about cohesion policy, and therefore we're working in the context of cohesion policy programme. So you have a programme discussed between Member States, adopted by the Commission, a programme which sets out the main priorities for spending. So you have a programme for research and innovation with 3 priority axes indicating what are the objectives, how those objectives will be achieved, and the type of actions to be supported. It's then the job of the managing authority to select individual projects which will deliver those objectives. The Commission doesn't look at the individual projects. That's Member State responsibility. So as long as the Member State is selecting projects that comply, obviously, with the eligibility rules of the regulations, which will deliver that objective, then it is a Member State responsibility. The problem the Member State would have, if it has absolutely made a very bad choice of all its projects, and so doesn't deliver the results that should be intended, then there's a failure in the programme. And as Rudolf indicated, in some circumstances, when we come to close a programme, if you haven't delivered under the performance framework, you can ultimately suffer a correction because you haven't, not because of an individual project, but because you haven't delivered on the overall objectives that you said you would obtain. On the second point, again, once the programme is adopted by the Commission, the Member State has that certainty then that the Commission can't suddenly say, well, sorry, we've changed our mind, we don't think that programme is okay. So it gives that Member State the certainty and the stability that, provided that it is funding projects that are within that framework, then it is assured that it can declare the expenditure, get reimbursed, and so on. And the only real power the Commission has to enforce a shift in how the money is spent under a programme is using this provision related to the country-specific recommendations of saying, well, now something serious has happened, there's a country-specific recommendation endorsed by the Council, which means that you should shift your spending to a different area, and it can force the Member State to do that. So I don't think the scenario that you raised can actually take place, not within the context of the cohesion policy programmes.
Mr. Etheridge.
It's a very brief one, because that was really thorough, and I must admit, I'm impressed by your mastery of your brief. It was very good. But the one thing, and if it was covered in the presentation, please, I apologise, but what is the criteria for the selection of auditors in a member state? Do they have to be chartered or certified accountants, like might be mentioned in the UK, or is it different in different nations? And in which case, how is the strength of the system if it's different in different nations?
Thank you very much for these comments and questions. Concerning the audit authorities are not subject to a designation process and not subject to a certification by the Commission. The audit authorities are set up by the Member States, usually in the Ministry of Finance, or in some Member State in an inspectorate in charge of verifying financial control and audit in the Member States. They are usually professionals. They have to work in accordance with the internationally accepted audited standards. And the Commission has a very strict supervision over the work of the audit authorities. During the 2007-13 period, we have audited all main 47 audit authorities for regional policy, and we have concluded that 43 of these audit authorities are fully reliable, work in accordance to all quality standards, and the Commission can rely on their work. So even if there is no formal framework of designation of these authorities, I can assure you that we are working with professional people who have to respect standards. We have also a lot of cooperation with the audit authorities to design and work together our methodological framework, the use of checklists, the use of system audits requirements, and so on and so forth. So there are systems which are different from one country to the other. It depends very much on the administrative setup of these systems, but audit authorities are usually independent, professional, and if they are not, we are taking action to make them work up to standards in the very few cases where it was not the reality on the ground.
Let me come back on the second question. Perhaps just to underline on the first question, I think, as Frank said, the key thing is this requirement set in the regulation that the work has to be in line with internationally accepted audit standards. So that's the reference point that ensures the professional quality.